September 25th, 1867, New Orleans, Louisiana. Dusk smolders along Chartres Street while the river sends up a damp breath that silver plats the alleys, and cathedral bells begin their weighing of the hour against roast and chicory. In the carriage court workroom, brick sweating a little from the day, Rebecca Carter turns a bone-handled bodkin between finger and thumb until its modest chill teaches her pulse to keep time. Its eye holds a pinhead of lamplight, then releases it, a small star domesticated to service. White gloves and veils mounted on dress forms stand like pale magistrates in waiting, while from the salon a ledger exhales paste-sweet breath each time a leaf is lifted, as if the arithmetic behind the door had learned to purr. Shutters and doors try on their tempers, one latch insisting on its click, one hinge clearing its throat in petty pride, each piece of wood and iron rehearsing the old syntax of authority that has never had to apologize. She steadies a seam along a hidden waist with the flat of her palm and lowers the wooden clapper to press the cloth's memory into order. A thread of steam rises that smells of boiled starch and obedience. The shears at her elbow lie shut, not as blade, but as level. If asked, they will measure before they ever cut. Rebecca pricks the heel of her hand with the bodkin, not pain, only a sober summons, and hears her rule again as if from someone worthy of speaking it. That what was broken in silk must be corrected by precision. That heat without measure ruins both garment and justice. Names gather behind the sternum like verses set to an unshowy tune. Eliza first, then those gathered by kitchen labor and fairy wind, and she allows them to sit in their pews without calling roll. Some liturgies are kept better by breath than by voice. The bell's bronze language walks the roofs and pools in the courtyard, leaving the workroom air both sharpened and kind. She reads the room the way a smith reads heat, where the lamp warms the tabletop until paste would loosen, where a shutter left almost will lead a draught from kitchen to hall, where the sideboard's hollow can be counted on to cradle breath beneath a cloth. Beyond the arch a book's spine knocks once, as though to be agreed with. In here, camphor holds to linen with its medicinal hush. Rebecca lifts the latch and sets it down again. The tongue takes the keeper with a civility taught by grease and patience. She returns the bodkin to the crease of her fingers and lets its small gravity anchor her hand. No hurry, she thinks, only rightness. And the room, instructed by touch, obeys without argument. Steam thins to clarity, a pleat consents, a veil's edge lies down, as if ready to earn the vow it will later pretend to bless. Before the tale moves one step further, say from what place you attend this telling and the exact hour by your own clock at which it arrives. Night gathered along Royal Street in a lacquered hush, the Igui chandelier in the ballroom throwing a net of light so fine it seemed to catch every mote and make it bow. The long table wore its white like a decree, the weave so tight it swallowed shadow. Citrus oil braided with clove and browned butter, and the mantel fire held a courteous flame that refused to lean. Forks and knives rested in rigid pairings, crystal kept its small winter, and the clock on the mantel stitched a neat seam of seconds that pleased itself. Behind the sideboard door, a lark of air lived, a hollow that collected breath and kept it cool beneath linen, and the shutter left just shy of shut taught a slender draught to walk from sash to wainscot without stirring a skirt. Across Rampart the air changed its coat. Yards narrowed to palms, fences showed mended places, and kettles breathed cabbage and soap into night that did not mind the smell. A levee bell sounded like iron tapping a shoulder, and a bellman's cry dwindled into the ruts. Bread was cut thin, bowls were portioned by memory, and the street lamp's oil skim carried a halo that refused to flatter. Time did not play favorites. Cathedral bells laid a gloss on porcelain in one room, while the same notes steadied hands rinsing tin plates in another. A wash line took the evening's damp like a job done right. A child coughed once and found a blanket that knew what to do. Rebecca moved between climates without changing her name. The fitting room off the courtyard held beeswax, camphor, and cloth whispering when shifted. Pins made their soft metal rain against a cushion, and the bodkin kept the temperature of thought. In the service corridor, onion skin and lye offered an older sacrament. Hinges remembered scolding, and then, persuaded yesterday, declined to raise their voice. She lifted a corner of the ballroom cloth with the back of her hand and read the heat beneath as one reads a bar for temper, where warmth gathered at the head, where a cool seam ran under the sideboard, where a shutters almost would later draw air like thread through a needle's eye. At the doorway she stood long enough to map the table's weather to her breath. 2 counts for the drift that hugged the paneling, 1 for the hollows kept chill, 3 for the lamp's quiet encouragement at the far wall. She let the knowledge sit where names sit, not to decorate skill, but to make it obedient. Across the avenue, the wash lines white learned to shoulder wind without pride. Here, the linen learned to lie so smooth it mistook itself for righteousness. Time's duet, the bronze from Jackson Square and the deep-throated signal from the levee, tied their ropes through her ribs until her pulse kept both, and she stepped back into the corridor where doors, tutored, took their seats without quarrel. April light had been thin in the courtyard shed when the bargain was spoken, brick damp from a passing rain, the smell of lye holding the room steady while camphor contested it. Rebecca stood with hat in hand, the Iab merchant's wife pinning a fold on a bodice as if virtue could be installed with a tuck, the parish priest a polite crease against the jamb. "Seams without pucker, collars straight as law," Rebecca said, voice trimmed of every plea. In exchange, Eliza's name stays off any paper that travels. Ink did not rise to the moment. The wife's nod, careless, distracted by the mirror's comfort, took the place of a signature, and the priest's soft pretended to be witness, and was not. The boards remembered weight where Rebecca had stood, the way wood learns a stance. In the bookkeeper's office, beyond the salon door, columns paraded with their chins up, leather and paste, content with their own breath. Rebecca walked out of that shed with patience, dressed as hope, not fooled by lace, only willing to test whether a nod could behave like law. Days turned, bells counted, the levee spoke at intervals, the seam in her chest where names sit held steady. Thanksgiving markets thickened at Poydras with crates, barrels, and a cold sunlight that showed every nick in a man's knuckles. A clerk at a trestle table licked a pencil and tasted cedar dust as if it were enough. Tags were tied to wrists with string. Sleeves learned the small scratch of paper that would not keep anyone warm. Contracts gained weight as if fed, and the river accepted the shadows of all that writing without taking sides. Rebecca did not go there. Her day kept her to cloth. But news walks where doors think they can stop it. A kitchen boy returned with the smell of fish in his cuffs and would not meet any eye. A cartman, good at minding his own mouth, spat into the yard and found nothing to say. At candlefall, the narrow message arrived entire. Eliza placed to answer a ledger's hunger. Cholera, quick and unadorned, finishing the arithmetic. In the salon corridor, where wax made the floor forget footmarks, a single white kid glove lay palm up, a cuff the width of 2 fingers, the faintest stain from powder at the edge. It had slipped from a wrist trained to be admired. Rebecca picked it up and felt its softness tell her nothing about goodness. White is not a sin, she thought. It is merely a color that has been given work it did not earn. The glove's lightness did what no sermon could. It put heat behind her breastbone without making smoke. That was where the vow lodged, not in the glove, but in the hand that held it. She returned to the workroom and stood at the table where cloth learns its fate. The bodkin lay in its dish like a small instrument awaiting a steady player. She set it in her palm and listened to the way ivory forgot the day's warmth and took the room's cool. She pressed the eye to the heel of her hand until her pulse learned to slow. Names came to order without prompting, Eliza foremost, then Aunt Tildy, who had taught starch its manners, then the child on Chartres, who counted cracks in the step to steady a fever. She did not speak them. To say, each aloud would be to turn them into display. She let them take their places as a congregation does when the bell offers no argument, only time. The ledger behind the salon door turned a page and sighed as if content with its own arithmetic. Rebecca touched the seam of a veil and found the tiniest ruffle where the iron had missed. She smoothed it with 2 fingers, not because the bride deserved perfection, but because labor deserved witness. Fury wanted the hand to tighten. Measure asked for the hand to learn more patience than it believed it possessed. She let the bell at the cathedral build its phrase and stepped down again, and between those iron words she fixed her own. The correction will not be a flame that boasts. It will be a breath that teaches. In the corridor, the glove waited on the sill where she had set it, pale as a promise she did not trust. She left it there, not to punish it, but to let the air roughen its pretensions. Then she lifted the bodkin once, set it down like a plum, and went to tend the hinge that had been practicing its arrogance, for there is no point asking justice of a door that has not been taught courtesy. Night pressed its ear to the carriage court wall, and the workroom lamp made a small, obedient province of light on wood and cloth. Rebecca stood at the table and let her hand hover over each tool as if greeting old neighbors. The tailor's shears with their sober heft, the wooden clapper, smooth from steam and duty, the bone-handled bodkin, a narrow star she could steer by with her fingers alone. She did not choose for cutting. She chose for keeping, implements that held a line, that taught cloth to remember what was right even after hands left the room. She took the shears up, not to bite, but to weigh. The pivot sighed with the comfort of honest work, and the closed blades rested across her palm like a plum laid to timber. She angled them against the table's grain and felt the tiny chatter quiet when the metal settled true. The clapper, lifted, returned a whisper of warmth into her skin, residue from the iron's earlier kiss, its flat face promising restraint, not spectacle. The bodkin, rotated once, told her pulse to walk, not run. These were sentences awaiting their verbs, and she vowed again to speak them without flourish. At the pantry door, the jealous hinge rehearsed its grievance with a thin rasp, a proud throat unwilling to be forgotten. Rebecca let the clapper ride low along the panel, head angled as a shoulder would be for a friend needing passage, and pressed the knuckle gently until complaint dwindled to manners. From her apron she drew a trimming torn from a dead account, ledger paper with its old superiority dried out of it, and set the strip along a spice tin's rim so lid and lip would learn to close without telling on themselves. A fold of lint thinned under her thumbnail became a patient bed against future mischief. She walked the service hall once, reading the air with the back of her hand. At the kitchen's shutter she could feel the draft that would walk obediently when the slat was left to almost, not closed, not opened, a coin's mercy of space that turned wind from whim to instrument. Under the ballroom sideboard she touched the hollow where breath gathered and found its cool like a kept promise, a bowl beneath a table, waiting to be taught a better office. She marked neither with chalk nor ink. She placed them in the body shelf where names and measures sit without falling. Returning to her bench, she set the spice tin into the loose-wedged niche beneath the stair and pressed the tread down until wood forgot it had ever lifted. The paper along the lid's seam behaved. The tin agreed to silence. She laid the shears flat against the jamb and leaned the clapper's weight just so, making of them braces that would teach doors to receive instead of announce. No drama, only gravity. The bodkin she kept in her hand, its small chill a right-sized truth. A bell far off settled a phrase into the roof slate, and she received it like a seam receives an even stitch, neither hurried nor spared. Eliza's name and the others aligned within her as evenly as pins in a row. She gave them no speech, only the dignity of order. When she lifted the pantry latch once more, it rose without pride. The hinge, newly schooled, answered with a modest turn, and the corridor breathed in a cleaner grammar. She left the tools where they could listen for her in her absence, and stepped back into the night that had agreed, for the hour, to behave. Evening matured to true dark, and the house revealed its 4 altars as plainly as a catechism. First, the bookkeeper's office off the salon, calfskin-bound spines stacked like soldiers, ink smelling of gum and certainty, the seal's mouth shut, but pleased with its own weight. The desk had learned to keep posture. The lamp taught shadows to sit up straight. Rebecca stood just inside the door jamb's cool and watched paper pretend to be law. Lesson 1. Numbers are costumes sewn from pulp. Teach the cloth humility, and the wearer must bow. Second, the bridal salon, a pale theater where veils rehearsed the story of spotless beginnings upon padded shoulders. White garments looked toward the gilt pier glass as if reflection were approval. Waxed floorboards held their breath in admiration of them. The bodkin in her hand shone without shining, and she touched a hem's underface where stitches lived unseen, reminding herself that fabric obeys hands, not mirrors. Lesson 2. Whiteness is not a verdict. It can be asked to bear witness rather than conceal. Third, the back stair beneath the priest's accustomed path, banister polished to a darker honey, treads willing to teach a heel the difference between rise and presumption. The stairwell carried voices like a horn. The landing borrowed doctrine and gave back acoustics. Rebecca laid her thumb against the rail's thin place where years of gripping had pared luxury down to wood's plain truth. She stood a tread low and listened to how the space-shaped speech, even in silence. Lesson 3. Sermon belongs to angle and hour before it belongs to mouth. Geometry will correct what grammar flatters. Fourth, the banquet room. Table running white from end to end like a frozen river with chairs as its banks, the punch bowl crowned in its own reflection, silver rehearsing importance beneath a canopy of light. Linen held itself like an oath that had never been examined. Air moved cautious as a servant near the head. She passed at the room's lee and felt beneath the sideboard the quiet basin of chill where breath collected, and at the shutter left nearly, not shut, not open, the obedient pulse of air ready to be taught its route. Lesson 4. Authority eats and calls it sacrament. Let the table receive instruction under its own cloth, and it will remember the taste of consequence. She returned along the corridor, stitching the 4 rooms together with her steps, and in each she left only thought. No finger's boast, nothing a proud eye could accuse. In the office, the lamp would later persuade corners to loosen. In the salon, a veil would later be asked to see instead of blind. At the stair, a heel would meet a fact and learn. At the table, warmth would write. In a hand the cloth had not imagined. Bells outside the quarter cut the night into fair measures, and the house kept time with them grudgingly until taught. Rebecca held the bodkin like a star small enough to own and let its weight decide the next breath. She had made her map, leather to be humbled, white to be conscripted, voice to be trimmed by space, feast to be schooled under its own canopy. She turned the latch she had earlier softened and stepped into the yard, where brick gave back the lamp's modest glow, prepared to move from lessons to their proper uses when the hour permitted. Night set its cool hand along the service passage. The lamp there trimmed low, so plaster took on a soft grain, and flagstones kept a damp memory of day. Rebecca walked this narrow country by breath instead of number, one slow draw to the scullery threshold, another to the work table scored with old knife marks, a last measured exhale to the pantry leaf that yesterday had been taught its manners. She lifted the latch and felt the tongue clear the keeper without quarrel. The hinge answered with a softened turn, metal having learned discretion. In the hush that followed, the faintest seam of air traced her wrist from the kitchen shutter, left almost neither shut nor brash, toward the ballroom sideboard's hollow, where breath liked to settle beneath linen. At the back stair, she knelt and eased a spice tin from its niche beneath a loosened tread, the board rising and settling again with the modesty of well-rebuked timber. Inside, lint lay folded to patience, and a ledger trimming, once a column's pride, was fitted along the lid's lip to keep the tin from telling on itself. She pressed the paper's edge flat with her nail until it accepted its quiet work, then slid the tin back into shadow and lowered the tread to forgetfulness. A cup on the sideboard she inverted, porcelain domed like a small moon, so that water would be preferred when a mouth reached blind for ease. On the pantry shelf, she turned a key ring hook sideways so habit would miss it in a hurry. She touched the shutter's cord and found the sweet spot where draught obeyed a coin's width, coaxed rather than commanded, and tied the slat to that narrow courtesy. Cloth in the salon rustled under her palm as she smoothed a rebellious hem. Camphor kept its calm, beeswax its low light. In her apron, the bodkin kept the temperature of thought, a cool that reminded fingers to speak only what could be answered. Names arranged themselves under her breastbone, Eliza foremost, then the elder hands who had taught starch to mind, the children whose feet had learned not to wake a proud hinge, and she recited them inwardly, not as grief, but as inventory of duty. The cathedral's bronze set down another phrase over slate roofs. The levee's iron answered from the dark water. She braided both measures into her ribs so her steps would keep the same fairness. At the scullery door she raised and let fall the latch, up, hold, down, until the sound lay small and decent. A beam above sighed, the way timber does when it decides to be generous. Rebecca stood a breath longer in the corridor's trimmed light, the house newly fluent in courtesy around her, then turned toward the yard where brick held the night's cool, and the hour cinched to its exactness without asking for applause. Star-sharp cold threaded the courtyard by the cistern, and the brick gave back a faint damp that made the palm honest. Rebecca sat on the bench under the trellis where summer vines remembered how to climb, the shears laid shut across her lap, not as threat but as level, their weight a plain truth against cloth and bone. She lifted the bodkin and set its eye lightly to the inside of her wrist. The little ring of chill steadied her pulse into a workable measure. Over the rooftops, St. Louis sent a bronze sentence that walked the quarter. Farther off, the river's hooters answered with a deep syllable that did not beg to be admired. Between those notes she shaped her breath until it kept both roads. She took from her bodice a folded slip, names written earlier in a hand she refused to flourish, and pressed the paper flat against her breast so the corners learned the heart's cadence. She did not open it. She said each within, bead to bead, plain as a work song, Eliza first, then Aunt Tildy and her stern lie that could lift a stain without shaming the cloth, then the boy who ran messages and knew which doors to distrust, then the two seam apprentices whose wrists were still too slim for heavy shears. No ornament, no speech for display. A liturgy kept best by breath and spine, adding strength rather than smoke. She stood to read the yard by hand. The cistern's rim wore a dark ring of chill. The trellis slat nearest the wall held a splinter that would snag a careless sleeve. The hinge on the scullery door, corrected, now swung like a courteous sentence. Subject, verb, done. From the kitchen shutter came the mild, obedient stream she had tied to almost. Across the paving a shallow channel remembered where rain chose to go. She set these into muscle the way a singer pockets a key, to be reached for without thinking when the throat is dry. A coal-thin brightness stayed in the workshop, banked to thought. It sent up a clean bitterness that lifted iron and camphor into the same honest company. Rebecca kissed the bodkin's spine, not for luck, but for rightness, and returned it to her apron. Then she set the shears' closed pivot to the bench as if to bless the wood with balance. A spark could be had with a scratch, but readiness is a different matter. She declined the show and chose the steadiness. From the alley a cartwheel grumbled, then blessedly went on. A shutter somewhere corrected itself and kept still. 10 from the cathedral arrived round and true, finding bone before they found air. 11 walked after, not as echo but as companion, and the space between them clarified the road. The service passage waiting with its new discretion, the bookkeeper's door drawing in breath through the baseboard seam, the sideboards hollow-banked cool beneath linen. She drew the paper once more, set her mouth to it without breaking the fold, and put it back where warmth would hold the names in rank. She lifted the shears and tucked them under her arm so metal would not gossip against stone, then crossed from brick's damp circle into the scullery's latchlight. The door accepted her weight and took its seat without vanity, hinge declining to sermonize. In the corridor, soap and wood kept their modest weather. At the stair, the post's thin place remembered her thumb. Rebecca did not glance back at the bench where the bench already knew its part. Midnight would ask for exactness, not spectacle. She let the bells rest between words and walked the learned road, a woman carrying breath, measures, and names sufficient to the hour. 11:30 eased its cool brow against the glass, and the bookkeeper's office made a small country of brass nib, calfskin, and lamplight the color of weak tea. Paste sweetened the air with its tidy conceit. The seal press waited with its jaw shut and pleased, while columns marched down pages as if posture were proof. Rebecca stepped through the threshold with a coal scuttle held like a sacrament and let the floor receive her weight without announcing it. The boards remembered the lesson taught by patience, not force. She knelt by the grate and set a hollowed shaving so that ember would find a bed and not a stage, then breathed once to make sure the room's lungs obeyed the near set. Door. From her apron she brought the spice tin and kept it in her own shadow. The lid, taught to close without tattle by a line of dead arithmetic, agreed to silence. The folded lint within looked up like a modest pillow, waiting for a steady head. She slid the tin shut again, and with 2 fingers nestled a wick beneath the grate's lip where the baseboard draught found it like a pilgrim allowed into a chapel. The doorstop measured the opening to a coin's mercy. Air learned sips instead of swallows. Flames did not rise. A glow walked along twine with a beginner's humility. Paper attended. Corners eased their stiffness by degrees. No flourish, only the fatigue of certainty giving itself permission to rest. A ribbon marker slackened as if a stiff-necked man had loosened his collar when no one watched. Rebecca squared the top ledger as a seamstress squares a hem, not to show compliance, but to feel the cloth's tooth, the page's slight rough where a damp thumb once paused. Warmth, gentle as breath after a hymn, coaxed a pale tide mark into view, not stain but remembrance. Plant before law, pulp before command. Beyond the desk, the lamp's chimney fogged and cleared, glass practicing a human habit without asking to be admired. "Mind the fire," the bookkeeper murmured, pen scratching like a narrow insect on a polished table. He did not look up. Men trained to trust columns seldom do. Rebecca inclined her head as one does to instruction that is not untrue, and turned the hollowed split a finger's width, so ember's counsel reached the wick, but did not boast about it. A curl of warmth made its slow way beneath the desk, where the room kept its shallow pool of air, and the draught she had tutored carried the lesson along the baseboard in a courteous procession. The seal press gleamed, unsummoned. Sand waited in its shaker for obedience that would not come. The pen faltered, then blotted a dark comma into a line that had expected itself to be sentence. He shook grit over it. The blot swallowed the remedy without changing its mind. A ledger's corner lifted and lay down again, the way a mother corrects a child's posture with 2 fingers. Columns, upright all evening, remembered they were ink, inside lines drawn by hands, not commandments dropped from any mount. Rebecca let her palm touch the door and felt the room draw its careful breath through her fingers before moving on. She pinched the stop narrower by a hair. The draft thanked her with a discipline only a patient ear could hear. No smoke stained the ceiling, no drama betrayed the act. Only the arithmetic spine found the modest weight of weather and adjusted. From the square, a bronze note slipped through the shutter slat and crossed the molding to rest its cool hand on the ledger's backs. The bookkeeper coughed as if correction were dust. His eyes smarted with the idea that the room had learned a new grammar in his absence from humility. She closed the scuttle with modest care and stood without carrying flame, leaving only arrangement. The door, set to near, unlatched itself a courtesy, and then resumed its discipline behind her. In the corridor, soapstone and sparse light kept a decent weather. Hinges, shamed into kindness the night before, made no sermon. Behind her the numbers discovered they could bow without breaking. Paper kept its secrets and let go of its pride. The seal waited all night and bit no one, and the law that lived in columns felt the honesty of heat and did not say its own name so loudly. Near midnight the pantry corridor held a sift of flour that turned steps into pale handwriting and then forgot them. A lantern on a hook burned low and close, a small halo that minded its own business. The air along the baseboard moved with purpose from the shutter tied to almost toward the undersill, breath-walking where it had been shown to walk. At the bend, a scullery girl in a borrowed apron clutched a basket to her ribs and fixed her gaze on the back kitchen door as if attention could soften iron. The steward's voice came from the stoop, thin and pleased with itself. "Back out," he snapped, keys chattering at his belt like small coins boasting of their metal. Rebecca stepped from the scullery turn with the hammerless balance of a woman who knows doors better than men who order them. The shears were not with her now, nor the clapper in hand, but their teachings had collected in the body. She read the latch, no longer a braggart, not yet a friend, and set 2 fingers beneath its tongue, lifting just enough to clear the keeper without giving the corridor anything to repeat. Between thumb and plate she slipped folded linen, a narrow strip retired from hemming to take up the office of gentling law. Metal accepted the amendment. The hinge, chastened the previous night by tallow and patience, offered a small, respectful turn, iron having learned that courtesy is not weakness. Rebecca knelt once and leaned the wooden clapper, brought from the workroom for this hour, at the base of the panel, its flat face angled as a shoulder that will not be moved by habit. No strike, no clang, only weight translated into manners. Draft stepped through without show and lowered the lantern's flame by a hair that no one would name. "Now," Rebecca said, voice pitched no higher than bread's crust, and the girl slid through, basket finding the space like a skiff discovering current. The steward reached, reaction, not courage, and his keys snagged on a nailhead that wood had held in quiet readiness. Brass clicked, pretended drama, and then hung like a lesson choosing a pupil. He swore under breath with a sound that neither frightened nor impressed the corridor. The lantern kept its circle. The flour dust settled, as if glad to stop talking. Rebecca drew the linen free and folded it once for later use. She did not look at the man on the stoop. She set her palm on the panel, thanking it for what it had learned, and let the eye latch-seat itself again with a modest consent. Behind the wood, the girl's footfall changed its diction from hurry to surety, and wicker brushed cloth with the relieved sound of work allowed to continue. The steward worked his key ring free and made a small theater of authority out of retreat. It did not take. Elsewhere in the house, a door practiced its new temper and closed without pronouncement. Down the corridor, the back stair kept its geometry for later. Above, the salon's veils minded their own breath. Rebecca eased the clapper away from the jamb, an inch only, and felt the panel hold the improved courtesy on its own. She turned toward the central hall where the clock's neat tick stitched propriety, and the priest's tread would soon meet angle and be trimmed. The pantry corridor exhaled through the shutter's narrow grace, and Flower's faint snowfall lay undisturbed, a page closed after signing. The door remained a servant rather than a petty king, and the hinge, remembering its lesson, offered the kind of silence that keeps a house honest. The back stair rose through the house in a ribbon of dark honey, whale oil light smoothing the rail until it shone like the inside of a shell. From the dining room below drifted spice and heat in well-behaved ribbons. From the upper passage came a cooler seam that kept its counsel along plaster. Where the two airs met on the turn, they made a tempered weather that asked a man to watch his footing. The hall clock ticked with a needle's certainty inside its bevels, the sound running the length of the banister like a discreet amen. Rebecca stood one tread below the bend, shoulder in shadow, thumb resting on the rail where polish had thinned to truth. The grain under her hand ran straight as a sober thought. The post took her small weight and gave it back without argument. She had learned this rise the way a singer keeps a key, by body, where a board prefers to declare itself, where another accepts correction with grace. Below, hinges she had chastened kept their silence. Above, a latch remembered to be kind. The bodkin in her apron held the temperature of prudence, cooling the pulse rather than hurrying it. The priest entered with his voice already trimmed to sermon, a glass held at the angle of authority. "Give thanks in the order appointed," he began, vowels burnished against his teeth, and he set his heel to the first lift with a trust learned from habit more than from wood. Geometry answered. Not a trap, only a fact. The tread with its modest difference asked the foot to listen. Balance revised rhetoric without insult. His free hand took the rail with a quickness that sought dignity and found honesty first. No clatter, no theater, only breath inserting itself where ornament had meant to sit. The wine drew a slender curve down the glass's outside like a line struck through a boast. The clock stitched another second into the stairwell's hush, and the space itself became a tutor, trimming the sentence down to what the hour could carry without swelling. As it is meet and right, he tried again, his voice toned closer to work than to display, and set the next foot with a caution he would not name. Rebecca moved half a pace, not to catch him, but to stand where harm would not find anyone smaller. Her thumb pressed the rail's thin place, blessing wood that had gone from ornament to usefulness. From Jackson Square a single bronze note entered through the fanlight and walked the molding to the priest's chest, where it settled like a hand and asked him not to mistake height for authority. He swallowed, not pride, but distance, and the glass steadied into a common object, not a staff. By the landing, his breath had learned a smaller key. "Carry that tray with care," he said to no one in particular, and the instruction returned to him as if translated. "Carry your words the same." He passed into the upper passage where doors, newly mannered, received him without flourish. Rebecca let the stair reclaim its quiet shine and stepped down one tread, reading again the cooled seam of air that moved under the rail and the warm ribbon that climbed from feast to sermon. Angle had paid the lesson with gentleness. Time had seconded it. She turned toward the wide hall where white cloth and a great bowl waited to discover that witness could live under the same canopy as plenty. The banquet room was a lake of light framed in wainscot, the chandelier's many tongues licking brightness into corners until shadow had to mind itself. The table ran long as a winter river. The white laid upon it pretended it had never touched water or sun only approval. Silver stood in disciplined gleam, crystal kept a private frost, and the punch bowl, the room's crowned island, held every face it could in its shallow world. The mantel clock paid out seconds like thin coins, not to be spent twice. From the shutter tied to nearly came the measured breath she had taught, a seam of air threading the room from sash to sideboard without disturbing a cuff. Rebecca passed along the table's lee, her fingers respectful of the linen's ambition. She knelt by the knee-hole where a chair nested, and with the back of her hand read the cool gathered under the board, the sideboard's hollow, lending its quiet store to the long plank's underside. From her apron she brought a sliver of lampwick and the square of lint she had thinned earlier. She pinned the wick beneath the table's lip, where eyes did not graze, and set the lint there as a patient bed. The act made no sound a proud ear would own. At the shutter she tested the cord and left it to its coin's width. Air obeyed, as a trained creature does when called softly. The mistress presided at the head with lace at her throat that wished to be law. Overseers made a porch out of their postures near the door. Guests arranged themselves in little eddies of conversation, voices held like saucers to avoid spills. A veil's pale drift from the salon doorway pretended to sanctify the room by proximity. Rebecca trimmed a mantel lamp for the sake of ceremony. The flames lift and settle a polite show that disguised a different choreography. The small draft she had invited set off on its pilgrimage, carrying the ember's lesson under the board's long belly. No smoke announced itself. Linen did not scorch. It learned. At the host's end, on the cloth's inner country where starch kept the weave proud, warmth began to write in a script meant to be felt before seen. A deeper shade no eye would name aloud, a ripple that was not stain but sentence. The bowl shivered a reflection so slight it could be called a blink. A guest paused with a spoon half lifted, forgetting which praise he had been about to deliver. Another touched her wrist as if a bracelet had tightened of its own mind. Midnight stepped into the room, one bronze foot at a time. The first stroke laced the air between chandelier and floor. The second seated itself among knives. The third slid along the table's spine and encouraged the undercloth to keep the lesson. The fourth met the bowl and quieted its pride. The mistress reached for the bell-pull, that pale vein embroidered into the wallpaper, and found it unequal to purpose. She let her hand fall with a smile too tidy for the hour. The overseers revised their small talk into silence and did not notice they had done it. Rebecca touched the table's underside once to test for harm, and found only discipline, the warmth obedient, the lint patient, the draft modest, as prayer said, in the back pew. She set a folded napkin on the sideboard, as if to honor bread that had not yet arrived, and moved the inverted cup she had placed earlier into a position where water would be first to greet a thirsty mouth. At the head, the veil over the silver basin quivered, then surrendered to stillness, and the cloth that thought itself a crown learned to be a witness. When the last of 12 stones had been laid into the night by the bell, the room could not return to what it had been. Linen bearing its private testimony, air moving by covenant rather than habit, the bowl reflecting faces it no longer owned. Rebecca stepped into the corridor where hinges, newly meek, made a passage of courtesy. Behind her, authority sat where it had sat, and discovered, without bruise and without blood, that consequence had taken a chair at the same table and would not be asked to leave. Pre-dawn laid a faint silver along the courtyard bricks, and the air cooled enough to remember rain, though none had fallen. Beneath the gallery, lamplight kept a small vow on the scullery sill, while the cistern held its dark circle like an eye that trusted her hand. Rebecca set the spice tin on the stone curb, its rubbed lid catching only a shy gleam, and lifted the dipper. Rope hummed once as the bucket rose, a low fibered note older than any clock. Water poured in a steady ribbon over brass, no flourish, only completion, and the quiet hiss that answered sounded like a long-kept breath set free by measure rather than show. Metal forgot heat under her palm and settled to its honest cool. She pressed the ledger trimming along the tin seam flat with a thumbnail, the paper that once had pretended to be law, now content to serve silence. Then she closed the lid without a click and let the lint inside keep its patience for another hour. In the lean-to, she returned the clapper and the shears to their fellowship among plain tools, handles touching, edges put to rest, a congregation that did not rival itself. The bodkin remained in her apron, no flair to ask of it, only steadiness. Names within her changed their brightness from spark to ember, Eliza foremost, then the elders who taught starch its civility, then the small ones whose steps she kept from waking proud wood, each glowing enough to warm, none demanding to blaze. By the scullery step she tipped a second cup to the ground and watched the circle darken, then drink itself inward until a thin ring remained like a seal pressed to close a matter without threat. No ledger would enter that figure. The soil accepted it without argument and held its witness better than paper. Behind her, the house remembered its lessons. A latch lifting and sitting with courtesy, a hinge declining to speak where silence honored mercy, a door choosing to be servant instead of judge. From the quarter's edge, a levee bell laid a single iron syllable across the roofs. The cathedral kept its tongue for now. Rebecca rested her hand on the tin a moment, a blessing given as one gives to bread cooling on a board, and lifted it to its discreet place among honest things. A bucket with a mended stave, a jar for seed, a box of bent nails destined for second lives. The courtyard's faint damp rose around her wrists like a modest benediction. She stood until the hour found its proper cinch, neither triumph nor lament, only balance, and then turned toward the passage that had learned to welcome without boast, carrying with her the cooled exactness the day would need. Dawn thinned over the levee, and bayside streets rubbed the grit from their stones, while shutters tried their first creaks of the day. Officers came up Chartres with writs worn smooth by handling, their collars damp with the night's last breath. They spoke the language of paper as if weather, and it carried the same courtesy as a forecast for those it did not favor. Rebecca stood on the stoop where the boards held a little cool, and let her weight be exactly what it was, no more, no less. Doors she had tutored took the moment as a chance to prove they remembered. A latch rose without fuss, a hinge yielded without complaint, a threshold kept its kindness even for steps that did not earn it. Cabin shutters along rampart opened by careful inches, faces shaping a ledger the desk behind the salon would never hold. A square of white lifted once on a wash line and fell back, intent on useful work rather than display. No name was sung out. Names traveled rib to rib like a cup passed down a crowded table so that each might drink without waste. Across the quarter, shop bells tattled their bright arrivals, and the market answered with baskets and bread, pretending this morning was ordinary. It was, and it was not. By noon, heat had found stone and kept it. The cabildo's chamber held the cordial odor of ink and old wool. Benches met with bodies as if Sunday had been called by mistake. A clock in the hall ticked briskly but without authority. Light from high windows made dust honest. Papers lay spread with corners slightly darkened where unsure fingers had worried them, and pens sat in their wells with the self-importance of tools that mistake neatness for truth. Questions came staked like pickets, intent on a straight fence. Rebecca let answers be exact where exactness would not betray, and kept silence where speech would make a wrong lesson large enough to live. She did not lift her chin to signal defiance, nor lower it to suggest repentance. She allowed time to do its appointed work, while her breath kept company with the measured strokes from Jackson Square. At the first iron numeral, the clerk's hand paused above a blot that refused to behave for sand. At the second, the magistrate's fingers sought the chair's arm, as if oak could lend him judgment. At the third, the priest in the back remembered the turn of a stair and trimmed his throat's ambition without knowing why. Outside, a scrap of white hung in a narrow alley, and remembered it was cloth meant to cover, not tag. Inside, the room learned that eloquence cannot prevail upon a thought that has been taught to stand. When talk had spent itself and the bell completed 12, those watching exhaled as one body, not in victory or in grief, but in recognition of weight set on a balance and left to remain there. The officers gathered their paper as if it had never curled at the edges. Law resumed the posture it prefers. They took her down again through heat that did not pity. Columns cast long bones of shade across the portico, and steps transmitted stones cool into the soles of her shoes. Reckon fairly, add no blessing. Street dust platted briefly under a wagon, then fell apart as if forgetting it had joined anything. Behind, the chamber shuffled its neatness into place. Ahead, the bell's echo moved from air into that private room where memory keeps what it needs. Rebecca walked forward, not bowed, not unbowed, while windows, mouths, and ledgers recalculated themselves in light of what the night had already taught under a roof. Late light slipped through the holding-room slit and spread a pale bar across limewash, blunted by dust until it felt like cloth laid gently over a face. Stone kept a temper that did not flatter and did not wound. The bench beneath Rebecca offered steadiness, worn smooth by backs that had practiced. Waiting. Outside, the road worked its ordinary grammar, wheel on grit, hoof answering curb, while within the corridor a key turned only as far as duty required and let silence resume its rightful chair. Air moved in small, legible phrases. Leather pausing at a seam, a heel reconsidering, a latch consenting to seat itself without pronouncement. She rested her hands on her knees where cord had taught a redness that now faded to a sober memory, neither boast nor injury. Names arranged themselves behind the breastbone as evening congregants. Eliza first, then the elder hands that trained starch and measure, then the small ones whose feet had been spared proud hinges, and each took a place without jostle. She did not speak them. Attendance is strongest when kept by breath, not by show. The city rehearsed its noise, judgment pretended to be taller than a man, stillness trimmed both to fit inside the room. Whiteness rose in her, thinking freed of its old arrogance. Not glove, not veil claiming to be law, but washing lifted between doorframes, shirts shouldering wind with unremarkable courage, an apron consenting to shade bread, a strip of cloth offering a child's nap unobserved. The color went to service and found honor there. Ledgers returned to pulp in her mind and stayed quiet. Bells remembered their proper office, marking time for hands and hearts, not commanding them. Doors learned the new catechism, to receive before they judge, to close without scolding, to open without display. She lifted her face toward the narrow view. A wedge of sky the color of skimmed milk, an elm leaf worrying its own green against iron, a slice of road large enough to hold a man's step. It was sufficient. Where light met bar, brightness made a brief rung no foot could use, then withdrew with dignity, leaving a clean square upon the wall. Rebecca leaned forward until her shoulders made a porch for the air to pass through. Even a body can be threshold if it has been taught. Somewhere down the corridor, a door declined to clear its throat. The room accepted that mercy and gave it back unspent. She folded her fingers as if cupping water to be shared and let the quiet settle over her like linen taken in from the line, sun-warmed, uncharged, prepared for useful work. Evening slackened the heat along the levee so the river could hold both rumor and reflection without spilling either. Ropes lay in their loops, barrels sweated, and porch rails took elbows as if that had always been their vocation. In courtyards, under galleries, and at stoops beyond rampart, the tale went about its business the way beans climb a string, touch, lean, hold, and keep on. It did not proceed as a march, it made cadence, traded mouth to mouth, until even the fences seemed to tilt an ear. They remembered Rebecca's work as measure. Shears were spoken of not as teeth, but as level, the tool that taught doors their behavior and hands their distance. The clapper, once a pleat's tutor, took seat in the mind as a shoulder lent to wood when wood must learn civility. The bodkin, small as a star drilled in bone, showed itself to be the firm compass by which a pulse could be steadied. Ledgers, chastened, lived in the nose more than the eye, recalled for the fainted sweetness of paste, turned honest by warmth rather than for any claim to command. White cloth climbed from throne to line, shirts lifting in a yard's honest weather, aprons covering bread, a strip knotted for shade at a child's neck. Bells, having retired from bossy duties, kept company with labor, calling hands to gather and letting them go without reproach. Doors earned praise when they received without pride. Hinges were complimented for learning to whisper. Names were planted like seed in small mouths and found weeks after to have taken root. At a shed that borrowed itself for a school, a girl chalked her mother's name twice so the board would be made to keep it. At a stoop, a boy swung door once and read the improved hush like a letter he could sound out. In a yard, a dulled silver bowl, rescued from its vanity, caught rain for parsley, and the taste bent toward good sense. Quilts pieced from stubborn pale scraps and louder cloths aired over rails and warmed sleep without sermon. When sorrow sat, it was given a chair. The tale made room for it and declined to flatter anyone with forgetting. Verdicts were named for what they were, opinions dressed in oak. The account favored consequence, not ease. Some nights, the story said that in an office paper remembered it was plant. Other nights it spoke of a stair, answering rhetoric with geometry. Most nights it arrived at a long table where linen learned to carry truth under the very hand that had demanded honor. Discrepancies did not thin the thread. They gave it breath the way a chest rises and falls and remains a chest. The river went on, seeing what it sees and saying nothing of it. The city pretended not to hear and altered by inches. A latch greased, a cup turned toward water, a clerk pausing long enough at a blot to suspect its mind. When darkness widened and talk thinned to humming, hands, smoothed aprons, and benches were left warmer than found. The tale kept its promise to dignity. No spectacle, only weight distributed justly, and tools employed for life rather than for vanity. If this telling has taken a place at the hearth, return and keep the watch with us. Lend a thumb's print of favor, and set your thought or question in the common register, so the next name may be faithfully carried.